Okay, let's get started because we do have a pretty stacked agenda to get through tonight. So first of all, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening for this really important panel. And I'm really grateful and humbled to be hosting this conversation tonight and provide this space to hear from some very important Anishinaabe leaders from across the incredibly special Great Lakes. My name is Michelle Woodhouse, and I'm the Program Manager of Water at Environmental Defence Canada. And I'm also part of the Métis Nation, with my mother's family being from a place called Manitou-Sakakigan, which is also known as Lac Saint Anne, and that means Spirit of the Lake. I have a Master's of Science in Environmental Applied Science and Management from Toronto Metropolitan University, and I've been focused on and working in Great Lakes water protection work for quite a few years, from more of a formal educational and institutional background, as well as being a grassroots water protector myself, a climate justice activist, and an Indigenous rights advocate and defender. I've been working on shutting down Line 5 for just over 2 years at Environmental Defence, alongside Indigenous nations and settler allies working to protect the Great Lakes for the 7 generations to come. And if you don't know who we are, we're a leading Canadian advocacy organization that works with the government, communities, environmental groups to help defend clean water, a safe climate, and healthy communities for all. And I'm so excited to welcome you tonight to today's live talk, Great Lakes Under Threat, Indigenous Water Protectors on Line 5. And first, to start us off, I want to start off with a land acknowledgement. And in this case, it's a water acknowledgement. It's a Great Lakes acknowledgement, just to get us started off in a good way. So the Great Lakes Basin encompasses the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Algonquin, who have inhabited these lands and waters for at least 14,000 years. All of these nations are sovereign nations and are rights holders in their respective territories. Settlers have been invited into these places in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And in the spirit of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement, which is something that is from where I'm from, based in Tekaronto, I acknowledge as a Métis and British Canadian woman, water protector, and member of this ecosystem, the sacred covenant with nature that this agreement holds, where inside the dish are all the plants, the animals, the trees, the waters, and everything you need to be healthy and happy. The waters of the Great Lakes continue to care for all of us who live here, yet they continue to be treated with disrespect and as objects or resources to be exploited and commodified. Many of us have lost our connection to the waters and have lost our ability to relate to the waters as living entities. In an age of environmental degradation, following years of disharmonious relationship with the waters that colonialism has brought to this land, I acknowledge the need for us to heal the waters within ourselves so that we may heal the waters that we share. I'm calling on myself and all other inhabitants who these waters support to see them for what they are, a living relation who is a part of ourselves that needs our love, our care, our respect, our compassion, and our commitment to repairing our severed relationship. This is especially important to remember today as we talk about the threats posed by Line 5 and the fossil fuel industry to the Great Lakes and to the inherent rights and treaty rights of Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes. Indigenous nations' inherent water rights must be upheld, and today we will talk more about why that matters. And I would encourage everyone to learn more about where you're calling in from and the land on which you are on. And as we start this webinar, let us keep in mind that it is Black, Indigenous, and people of color who have been and continue to be disproportionately impacted by pollution, climate change, and environmental injustices. And so to get us started, we were actually going to play the water song, a version of the water song in Anishinaabe Moan, because we are in a bit of a tight time frame. And so, but that wasn't working very well, the quality. So that's going to be dropped into the chat because it is a really beautiful song. And I really encourage everyone to listen to it. Many of you would have already heard this song or a version of it. So today we have with us Whitney Gravelle, who is an Anishinaabe Kwe president of Bay Mills Indian Community. which is located at the Straits of Mackinac. And Ogimakwe Chief Whitney Gravelle, as I said, is a citizen of the Bay Mills Indian community, which is also known as the Place of the Pike, Ganuj Ganat Ganing in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And currently Whitney serves as the president of the Executive Council on behalf of Bay Mills Indian Community and serves as the chair of the Department of Interior Secretary's Trial Advisory Committee and commissioner on the Michigan Advisory Council on Environmental Justice. Our next speaker is going to be Aurora Conley, who is the vice chair of the Anishinaabe Environmental Protection Alliance and a community leader of Bad River Band of the Lake Superior Chippewa. Aurora grew up on the shores of a mighty Great Lake on the sacred homelands of the Bad River and Lake Superior, also known as Mashkizibi, meaning Medicine River, and Lake Superior is known as Gichigami. Over the years, Aurora has worked with the Bad River Legal Department, helping to organize and coordinate groups opposed to mining activities, and also now a major pipeline. And I will just mention that we're not sure yet. It looks like we might not be able to have our third speaker, Chief Linda DeBoski, who's an Anishinaabe Chief of Chaging First Nation, which is located on Manitoulin Island, and that's just down the way from the Straits of Mackinac as well. I will still tell you a bit about who she is. So she is from Chaging First Nation, and she is the chief. She graduated with honors from the Confederation College of Civil Engineering and Technology program in Thunder Bay, is the proud mother of 2 and grandmother of 1, and was first elected to Chaging First Nation Chief and Council in 2013, and she became the only second female chief to lead Chaging First Nation in 2015. So she's currently serving her 3rd term, and she strongly believes in leading with compassion and heart, and with her mission being to listen to the people. She does send her regrets. She's caught up in another important commitment at the time. So if Linda isn't able to join us in the nick of time tonight, she does send her regrets, but just know that the Anishinaabe Nation, which represents 39 First Nations in Ontario, does stand in solidarity with their kin across borders in supporting the closure of Line 5 and protecting the Great Lakes for the 7 generations to come. And the Anishinaabe Nation does believe that the use of the 1977 treaty by Canada is something that Canada actually also should be revoking, and in the context of the fact that this treaty makes no mention of First Nations or tribal rights. And also Canada has broken all of the treaties that it holds with First Nations peoples. So it really has a duty to uphold and honor those treaties and honor and uphold inherent and treaty rights of First Nations in the Great Lakes Basin and across Turtle Island. Okay, so before we get started, I just want to explain a little bit about how you can interact with us live on this webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, there's a button called Q&A, just for some people who haven't used like Zoom. I think a lot of us have at this point, but just hit that button, type in your questions. Our team will relay them to me. So we usually do get a large volume of questions. We won't get to all of them. We'll try to get to as many as possible. We are recording this event today and posting it on YouTube and Facebook. So if you have to leave early or there's something you want to share with a friend that you learn, you can, we will be sending it around afterwards and you can view it afterwards. Okay, so let's go to the slide of the pipeline map now. And I'll just start us off. I'll give you a little bit of an overview. So today we're going to be discussing the imminent ecological disaster in the making that the Line 5 pipeline poses to the world's largest surface freshwater system, the Great Lakes. This pipeline crosses directly through the heart of the Great Lakes, stretching from the western tip of the Lake Superior watershed, and then takes a shortcut through the Straits of Mackinac, which connect Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And this ends at the southern tip of the Lake Huron watershed in Sarnia, Ontario. You're also going to hear about how Line 5 is a direct threat to the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes. All of our speakers are here from across colonial borders, but together represent one united nation, which is the Anishinaabe Nation. You will hear more about how Indigenous leadership is standing up for the Great Lakes for the 7 generations to come, and how Indigenous-led water protection movement is resisting the owner of the world's largest crude oil network, Canadian-owned corporation, Enbridge, Inc. You will also hear at the end about what the alternatives are for meeting our energy needs without Line 5 and how you can help to support the international coalition of Indigenous nations and settler groups that are working to shut this dangerous, old, and leaky pipeline down. So let's get started. So the Great Lakes are an incredibly significant freshwater system for the world and North America, which Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes have known as Turtle Island for at least 14,000 years. There's many places that we as Indigenous peoples consider important and sacred places of the Great Lakes. And so my first question is for Whitney, which is, can you speak to the ecological, cultural, and spiritual importance of places within the Great Lakes, such as the Straits of Mackinac, Lake Michigan, and Lake Huron, and this importance to the Anishinaabe and your people? And can you speak to the ways in which Bay Mills and tribes within Michigan have been working to protect these sacred areas and cultural resources for communities since time immemorial? And I'll go over to you now, Whitney.
Chimagwich Michelle, Ani Bojo, everyone, Gueden Nagabo Quain Dishnakas, Ganushnakani Ndonjaba. My name is the woman who stands in the north. My English name is Whitney Gravelle, and I come from the place of the Pike. And for those of you who are not familiar with Bay Mills Indian community, we are a signatory to the 1836 Treaty of Washington, which takes up almost 14 million acres of land and 13 million acres of water in the Great Lakes, and includes various parts of Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, and Lake Superior, and most importantly, the Straits of Mackinac, which will become a really centerpiece of the fight and the battle that is somewhat evolving around the Line 5 dual pipelines, as well as the Line 5 tunnel project. But before I want to talk about Line 5, I actually want to talk about treaty rights and what those mean to my people, you know, what they may mean generally to Anishinaabe in the Great Lakes. And it's really important to understand why a treaty right became a treaty right. And so if you look at the 1836 Treaty of Washington and you read on its face that treaty language, what you're actually going to see is a protection for the usual privileges of occupancy on the land. And that was later interpreted by federal courts to then mean the right to fish, the right to hunt, and the right to gather. And I often think back and give gratitude to my ancestors in those treaty negotiations, because I know that they were under insurmountable pressure to concede and give up things that were valuable to them as the United States began to expand. The state of Michigan would not have become a state without the 1836 Treaty of Washington. It actually became a state in 1837 after that treaty was executed. But our ancestors at that time, even though they were facing that insurmountable pressure, were trying to look 7 generations ahead, many generations ahead, to determine what did they need to protect in order to ensure our Indigenous way of life. And ultimately that needed to include our relationships with the natural landscape, our relationship with water, our relationship with the resources. And all of that is at play when it comes to the Line 5 dual pipelines, because it runs through the heart of that treaty ceded territory. And that's exactly what they were trying to protect, because they knew that a treaty right was so much more than the right to fish. It was about, as one of our elders, Frank Edowagijik always says, you know, you sing with fish, you play with fish, you laugh with fish, because as you are exercising that treaty right, you are living out your culture. You are living out who you are as an Indigenous person. And so when we look at Line 5 and we look at the dual pipelines and the litigation that is taking place around it, we are actually seeing again in history the for-profit fossil fuel industry take advantage and trample on the rights of Indigenous people. And those rights exist not only within treaty, they exist within international law, they exist within state law, they exist within federal law, and their rights afforded to us as a mutual exchange under that treaty language that is contained within the 1836 Treaty of Washington. And because it's an exchange, that right is meant to continue forevermore. And the federal government, state governments, the government of Canada then has a proactive obligation to ensure that that treaty right will continue to exist and that Indigenous people will be able to live out their lifeways. Without upholding and having a proactive affirmative obligation, we are setting ourselves up for ecological disaster where we will only be cleaning up the mess that will eventually happen. And that is so interwoven into our identities and how we view the Straits of Mackinac, how we view, the heart of Turtle Island. We see the Great Lakes as the birthplace of North America. It is the heart that keeps our land operating, that keeps us all alive. And if we were to experience a catastrophic oil spill there and suffer the consequences of that, we would be ultimately deciding to suffer the consequences of our Indigenous lifeways coming to an end. That is what a Line 5 oil spill means to me. It's what it means to my people. And we have a duty, just as our ancestors did before us, to protect that, because that wisdom carries today, that if we are going to maintain our sovereignty, if we are going to maintain our cultural lifeways, if we are going to be who we are as Anishinaabe, then we need to maintain that interconnected relationship with the land and with the water. And all of that, again, is interwoven into our teachings, because we understand that in the line of creation, we were not created last because we were the most important. We were created last because we are the least important. We rely on all that has come before us in order to be able to survive. And in any creation story, the first thing that is created is water. And that is why we have those teachings about water is life. Water gives us life. We are born from water. We live with water. We are in water. And so when we talk about protecting the Great Lakes, ultimately what we're talking about is protecting the future and protecting life.
Whitney, for all of those very powerful words. I find the creation stories of the Anishinaabe and the Great Lakes to just be so powerful and beautiful and inspiring. And I do think that everyone here tonight that maybe hasn't reflected on this before, just really I encourage people to understand that these places and spaces have meant something more than a lot. You can't even put it into words to the Anishinaabe people since time immemorial and other Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes. And they're very special places. The way I see it actually is that the Straits of Mackinac, and you did describe it, is it's comparable to other very sacred places that we know of in the world. In parts of the what's known as the Middle East as well. Just to really put into context for people. So for those of you who are just joining us, we just heard from Tribal President and Ogimakwe, Whitney Gravelle. So she did help us to explore and understand a bit more about just really what's at stake from a cultural perspective for the Anishinaabe of the areas that would be impacted by a Line 5 rupture surrounding her community at the Straits of Mackinac. So next we will speak with Aurora Conley. So first off, Medicine River, which is also, it's called Bad River, but it's also Medicine River, is another incredibly important part of the Lake Superior Basin and the Great Lakes, and so are the surrounding islands. Can you speak to the cultural, ecological, and spiritual importance of this territory governed by your tribe of the Lake Superior Chippewas? And can you speak to the ways in which your tribe has worked to protect these sacred areas and cultural resources for the community and for the Anishinaabe since time immemorial?
Thank you, Michelle. Bonjour, everyone. Kijugu Queen Indigenous Cause, Mashkazibing and Dunjama, Maine. I am known by the spirit name Sky Woman. My English name is Aurora Conley. I come from Bad River Band of Lake Superior. We're on the south shore of Lake Superior. I'm Vice President here of the Anishinaabe Environmental Protection Alliance that has been formed and operating for almost 10 years now. I work for the tribe in our land office. I'm from this community. I'm a mother, definitely a voice here in the community, and always try to be active and engaged in our community and be that voice. I wanted to thank Ms. Gravelle for speaking. You spoke about so many different things that are so connected, and I think that's what's great about doing these webinars. And when we speak about what we do to protect these sites and our homes and our rights, it's a lot about connections and relationships, like you said, with the land and with the waters, our communities, and with each other within those communities, whether it's at home and our closer knit communities, or whether we're across this region of beautiful freshwater that we've all been curated to protect, I suppose. So Ms. Gravelle spoke about a little bit about the creation stories, and I want to take maybe a little bit forward into our migration story. But when we came to these regions known as Lake Superior so long ago, like I said, I live on South Shore Lake Superior. Bad River also maintains a very small land base in the Apostle Islands on Madeline Island. Monique, Wanagween, our island there. And we have 125,000 acres of land here in Bad River. A majority of it, over 50%, being wetland and slough area. A slough being a region that is very kind, and what we like to call our nurseries for our wild rice, also known as Minoman, which is part of that migration story. We were told to continue in the west direction until we came across the food that grew on water. And when we got to this region, it was the wild rice that we found. And this is where we decided to stay in agreement that if we took care of the rice and respected and had a relationship with this ecosystem here in this land, that it would also take care of us as well. And we've been able to maintain them agreements since we've came to this area, and that's why I hold such importance. Since our creation and even our migration and settling into this area and making it our home and developing and deep rooting our relationship there, us as Anishinaabe people, as First Nations peoples, have had a variety of threats and ongoing issues, whether it was from a genocide and removal and colonialism, to the ongoing treaty periods, to the boarding school periods, and that also came with it, and a lot of threats. We've had to become quite resilient, and that also comes in a variations of ways. So when you ask, what do we do in order to protect these regions and to protect our culture and our ways of life, we've had to be very flexible and very resilient. When Ms. Gravelle also spoke about the immeasurable pressure that our ancestors were facing during those periods, I also think of that. There was a delegation that was sent from this region to BC as well, in the 1837, 1854 era. During that time, our chiefs went to DC and asking for some negotiations for somewhere safe for us to stay. And I always think about that too, that what would be considered a win or a loss during that time. And very grateful for them for looking out for our rights and for our future too, because we're almost pushing 200 years ago, and we're still able to fish and hunt and gather in these regions. And that speaks so highly to our strength and resilience that we've been able to maintain in that period. How we're able to manage it through that relationship with the land and the water. It's a reciprocal thing. It's reciprocated when we give to the water, we give that thanks, and the water, in return gives us a life and gives us more of a spirit aspect to be able to stand up for it, to give that voice and to stand up for the rights of the water and the land, because they also have their own initial rights. They might not have been outlined in the treaty, but I think it's an understanding that us as Anishinaabe and First Nation folks have that respect and that somewhat obligation to stand up for them in those spaces that we need to, such as the ongoing battles against Line 5 and government, and make those allies and connections as well. So we came here to this region, and we hand harvest the beautiful wild rice here in the sloughs among many across this area. We hunt and we fish walleye, and we still have ceremony and powwow and so much life that is still within us and within our culture and our people there, and to protect. And then it is difficult, and I'll speak on this too. We're only a people 2,000 on reservation for Bad River. We're 8,000 worldwide enrolled. And we're facing a variety of issues, not that are just environmental threats as well. And it's always been that interconnected with the land and the people and what happens to us when they were trying to come for the land and the ceded territories that we had given up. That took a toll on our people as well. A lot of depression and mental health issues, things that are still ongoing today, and those repercussions as well. We deal with opioid epidemics now, the highest rates of suicide, a lot of issues that are happening within our communities that require our focus and attention as well. But when you look at those dynamics of our connection and relationship to that land, it's always something that we come back to. And that's why, and that's how we maintain and are able to stay here. And I will just say that much, and that there's a variety of ways for people to be engaged. I'll be looking forward to speaking more on that after we hear from more. Miigwech, thank you.
Miigwech, Aurora. And for those of you who are just joining us, Aurora was just speaking to the significance, importance of her community's lands and waters and the place where they're from, and what it means to them as a peoples. And I get, like, for me, I'll just say that as when I think of the Great Lakes and I think of the Anishinaabe Nation, I think of one and the same thing. Same when I think of like Indigenous peoples and lands and waters. Like, the reason that land back is so important, for example, as a concept, is because the land is a part of us, and we are a part of the land. You cannot separate the two. So for Indigenous peoples to be fully thriving in who they are, it's very important that the land, there's access to the land is being protected, the waters are being protected. And just when you look at that map of Indigenous peoples that we were showing earlier, the Anishinaabe are spread across the Great Lakes. So you can see it's one and the same. To be Anishinaabe means to have the waters of the Great Lakes flowing through your body. And the waters from these areas are flowing through a lot of our bodies, of those of us who have grown up here, because we've 80% water, and this is the waters that we're relying on. So it really is a part of all of us. And I'm just very grateful to like be able to have people hear a bit more tonight about the significance of these places. So it looks like um, Chief Linda Dabosky is not able to join us for sure now. And so we can right now, we're making good timing. I guess what I'll say, just because I have been working alongside the Anishinaabe Nation here in Ontario, when it comes to the Line 5 pipeline and what's going on with that, and not to speak on behalf of the Anishinaabe Nation, but I will note that First Nations rights, First Nation and Indigenous, the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples across Canada for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit are like, this is affirmed within the Canadian Constitution under Section 35. There's also recent legislation that came into play that affirms the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and Canada's duty to uphold that and to uphold inherent rights and treaty rights of Indigenous peoples across so-called Canada. And I think that that is something important for us to all think about, given that Canada has broken all of its treaty promises and obligations that it's made with First Nations. And Canada was able to exist as a state because of the fact that those treaties were made between the Crown and between First Nations in the context that Canada would uphold its treaty duties and obligations. So that's something to think about. And I will also just mention places like Manitoulin Island and just the Anishinaabe Nation, Great Lakes region, but Manitoulin Island, where Chief Linda Dabosky is from, which it's a part of, it's located, it's the world's largest freshwater freshwater island in the world's largest freshwater system. It's also an incredibly important place. It's the island's being governed by the Three Fires Confederacy of the Odawa, the Ojibwe, and the Potawatomi, all of which are Anishinaabe nations. And this has been the case since time immemorial, predating any kind of colonial governance. And I think in the context of protecting the Great Lakes, the Three Fires Confederacy is so incredibly important because it really does show how the Anishinaabe Nation works together to protect these areas and the communities that thrive here for the many generations to come. And so right now, I think what time we're at 6:34. So yes, we will move on to the next section. And this one is a question that is for all of the speakers. And so I'll start it off by just framing it for everyone. So we know that fossil fuel corporations and extractive resource related industries have a history of not working well with Indigenous nations and behaving in exploitative ways that are reflective of ongoing colonial violence by these corporations and the nations whom they represent. So in Enbridge's case, it's Canadian owned. And so the first couple of questions here that we have are, and you can see in the slide that we have visible, this is showing the treaty territories for the Indigenous nations of the Great Lakes on both sides of the Canada-US border that are very relevant to this whole fight. And I encourage everyone, if you're not familiar with what the treaty territories are, to really familiarize yourself with them. And the question is, how are the actions of Enbridge in Canada impeding the broader Anishinaabe Nation's efforts to fulfill their ancestral duties to protect the Great Lakes for the 7 generations to come? And the second part B of that is, how are the inherent rights and treaty rights of Indigenous nations being violated and put under existential threat by the ongoing operation of Line 5? Which that's already been kind of touched on earlier, but maybe we'll just, start off now with, I don't know if Whitney, you want to go first, and then Aurora, for how the actions of Canada and Enbridge are impeding the Anishinaabe Nation's efforts and abilities to fulfill their ancestral duties.
Yeah, Michelle. So for Bay Mills Indian community here in the state of Michigan, both Enbridge and the government of Canada have been involved in various litigation. Some of that litigation is directly with the state of Michigan. Some of that litigation is before the Michigan Public Service Commission for the tunnel project. And then there are also 2 permit reviews taking place. One is a federal permit before the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and then the other permit is before the Environment, Great Lakes and Energy Department, which is a state of Michigan agency, again, for the tunnel project. And we have seen the government of Canada not only support Enbridge publicly, but then also enter litigation by invoking the 1977 Pipeline Transit Treaty as a means to forego the litigation that is taking place. And typically when the government of Canada submits a statement of interest invoking that 1977 treaty, what they are doing is they're saying, you know, we have a dispute under this treaty. This treaty supersedes the rights of states, the rights of Indigenous people, and we need to enter into negotiations with the United States in order to resolve the disputes under this treaty. And what that has effectively done is it has forestalled and prevented those litigation proceedings from moving forward. And when we have a delay and when we have a pipeline that is still in operation despite an easement being revoked by the state of Michigan and they are still embroiled in litigation, what we are seeing is the delay effectively being used to the benefit of Enbridge. We don't know yet what the outcome of those negotiations will be between the United States and the government of Canada, but we're seeing an active leverage and interference on part of the government of Canada to then in domestic litigation and in domestic policy and with the rights of Indigenous people like my own community somehow be shoved to the side for the prevailing interests of the government of Canada. And that is wholly inappropriate. When you start to look at the broader issue of international claims, you know, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People or free, prior, and informed consent, these are things that Canada has made an affirmative obligation to uphold, but they don't apply in these situations. This is obligations that the government of Canada has promised to their people in their country, but will not extend the same courtesy to those of us who are in the United States. And that is also inappropriate. And really, when you start to narrow down all of the issues, it becomes the issues of the rights of sovereigns. You know, what does sovereignty mean to us as a tribal nation? What does sovereignty mean to the state of Michigan as they are attempting to regulate their easements and protect their waters? What does sovereignty mean to the United States if they're not willing to uphold and defend the rights that they have made promises in treaties to Indigenous people? And so even though there's a bevy and various different environmental issues at play, various legal issues at play, if you can peel all of that back, it's a fight among sovereigns on, you know, who at the end of the day has the sovereign right to make the decisions about the land and the water and make the decisions that are best for their people. For Bay Mills Indian community, our treaty under the US Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and we want to see it be treated as such. We see our treaty not as a fictive document of the past, but as a living exchange. And when that treaty right is harmed, when it's not taken and given the care that it deserves and it should receive, then that treaty right has been violated. And there are consequences and actions that should be taken in order to prevent the violation of that treaty. When we look at line 5 and the land that it covers and the water that it runs through, it is not only a future threat, it's a current threat, and it is already caused harm to those treaty rights. Many people don't realize, but Line 5 is a very, very old pipeline, and already in its lifetime, it has spilled more than 1.1 million gallons of product in the state of Michigan. It runs along and near all of the reservations in the state of Michigan outside of the treaty ceded territories. And when you start to look at it from an environmental justice context, it is only Indigenous people and people of color that will suffer the ultimate consequences from a spill, because our ancestors fought for these lands and they know who we are when we are on these lands. We are Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes. We don't have the privilege to pack up and move. This is our land. This is our water. And so when it is poisoned, we become poisoned. When it is hurt, we become hurt. And that is why we're doing everything, that we can to protect the Great Lakes, because it, by extension, we're protecting ourselves and we're protecting Turtle Island, and our ancestors, like I mentioned earlier, had the wisdom to see that. For-profit fossil fuel corporations, whether it be Enbridge or anyone else, are in it for themselves. They will go to the media and they will try to state that they have good relations with tribal nations. But what they're really doing, whether it be through an Indigenous consultation policy or an Indigenous rights protection plan, it's all coverage. Because if Enbridge Energy or if any other company truly believed in free, prior, and informed consent, or believed in the treaty rights being rights that are not only held, but also rights that need to be protected, they would not ignore all 12 tribal nations in the state of Michigan asking for the decommissioning of Line 5. They would not ignore the Bad River Band asking them to no longer trespass on their reservation. They would not ignore the Anishinaabe Nation and the 50 more, tribal nations that have all come together, united against Line 5. And so that's what we ultimately see, when we start talking about fossil fuel extraction and climate change, and they are in it for themselves, and we are the ones that will suffer the consequences.
Amy, Gretch, Whitney, Aurora, do you want to, the same, I'll just repeat the question again, but so how are the actions of Enbridge in Canada impeding the broader Anishinaabe Nation's efforts to fulfill their ancestral duties? And how are the inherent rights and treaty rights of Indigenous nations being violated and put under existential threat by Line 5's operation?
Thank you. It's definitely a trespass. And by suing us, Enbridge suing us was not, that definitely takes its toll on our community in terms of our staffing and our leadership. And like I had mentioned before, a lot of the issues that we're already dealing with in terms of just a small oppressed community that's been attacked on many various levels. It definitely takes its toll. Even this evening, we were hoping to have the chairman and other council leadership, but their focus has to be elsewhere. I love defending what is our right to be here. And so Enbridge runs across our reservation east to west, or west to east, from the Superior area, Superior Duluth Twin Port area. In our watershed, we requested for them to leave. It's definitely a trespass at this point. And you have to remember that this pipeline was put in 50 years ago through an easement with the BIA, because the office that I work in now was not even developed. We did not have a land office. The BIA made a majority of the agreements and easements with the different tribes. The tribe agreed to it at that time, and And like Miss Whitney, I tried to imagine what kind of duress and what kind of things were they thinking of during those times. I was born in the 80s, and things in our community when I was growing up were still pretty grave. We didn't have anywhere close for groceries. We didn't really grow our own foods at that point. There was no vehicles. The gaming opportunities had not flourished for Indian communities yet. There were just a lot of issues back then, and that was, 35, 40 years ago. So having Enbridge come into this small community that barely has any revenue, and they what is sad is I think that they don't realize that we don't have support. And like I'll go back to the mining issue. One strategy that we found was definitely creating more relationships with those around us and our neighbors, and our brothers and sisters throughout the region. The threat is really in our watershed, in the water. A majority of the water comes through our watershed, goes into Lake Superior because our water runs north into the Lake Superior. Our sloughs and the Minoman, we like to think act as like a really amazing filtration system. And getting some of that great water that we have in this region too. In terms of the threats, they're ever changing. Depending on your perspective. And I think that's why we're here in this fight as well, and why, because their perspective on our importance just as a people has been duly noted. Like Miss Whitney also said, it is that lack of respect, and has been for us for a long time, but we're here. We have wonderful communities that have been resilient for a few millennia. We've learned a few things. We've learned how to speak their language, our own languages, and we're starting to become dual forces in how we combat these types of threats, how we remediate and take our lands back and take back our rights and affirm them. And it's just really a great time to be here, as treacherous as it might be. And all these different things that we face. And why do we stay? Like this year, we're having a really harsh winter. It's like ice hailing still outside right now. And I always joke, like, it's so I want to move, I want to go to somewhere tropical and go to all these places. But like Miss Whitney said, we don't have the privilege, and granted we could as individuals. But there's that connection and that deep relationship here. And, when the winters are really hard and it's so freezing and it's 40 below and you're really sick of winter, I question, why do we stay? Why are we still here? And a lot of it comes back to, that good seed, the Minoman, and our relationship to that and our protection of that. And just this land and that relationship spiritually that we all have with it. And that's why it's so important to us, because it's just really is connected with their identity. We could maintain and carry on as folks that don't have that relationship, but that's just not who we are as a people. We've gotten this far, and we're going to ensure that we can carry on in the future as well by practicing and being who we are with that connection.
Yes, very well said. Kachimi Wachigan, Aurora. I have a couple more questions for you both for us to answer. And and these are really, really important ones for folks to hear about. So what do you want to see from Canada and the United States when it comes to Line 5? And how can those that are listening in today, as well as people they know, help with furthering the efforts to shut down Line 5, which is one of the most dangerous crude oil pipelines in the world, operated by the largest crude oil pipeline network owner in the world, in the world's largest surface freshwater system. As I'm saying that, I'm just seeing that like visual I often get when I think of this, when I've looked at a North American crude oil pipeline map and how it's spread out, which is like these black veins going through Turtle Island. And then if you compare that with like a waters, like all of the different like big rivers and lakes in that map as well across Turtle Island, you can see like around the Great Lakes that not only is the fresh water concentrated, but so is a lot of the crude oil network, like infrastructure, the pipeline infrastructure. And it just makes me think about like those like blue veins of Mother Earth that give us life, and those black veins of the fossil fuel industry that we know we need to get ourselves off of for many, many different reasons. And yes, so what do we want to see from Canada and the US when it comes to Line 5 and to help and others to help shut down this really, really dangerous pipeline? And maybe Whitney, start with you again.
Yeah, of course. There's a very unique problem in our Western legislation and policy and decision-making process in the fact that we are very reactive when we enact policy or take on legislation. There's a problem that exists and we're trying to fix it. What's really missing is at the heart and core of Indigenous people and our Indigenous teachings is that next 7 generations. We can no longer be reactive, we must be proactive, especially when we're talking about climate change or when we're talking about maintaining water quality, because if we wait to be reactive to the harm that will happen, it'll be too late and we won't be able to turn things back. And so this is about looking ahead, understanding the consequences of our decisions, understanding, how we can enact things today to be proactive in protecting the treaty right, proactive in protecting the water. But no one ever wants to have that conversation because to be proactive does not allow for an instant gratification that we've become so used to in society. It usually involves a sacrifice, and we have to be willing to endure that hardship, whether it might be a slight increase in propane prices, whether it might mean, Enbridge having to make investments into renewable energies, whether it might be the government of Canada or the United States themselves dedicating money to infrastructure so that we can move away from fossil fuels. That initial hardship, whether it be an investment, whether it be at a governmental level or an individual level, must be something we are willing to endure and willing to commit to so that we can solve the problems of the future. Because again, that's what this is all about. That's what we're trying to protect. And so without that mind shift, without that change, we will continue to suffer the consequences of our own actions. And so for those of you who are in Canada, speaking to Canadian representatives about the solutions that already exist for Line 5, sharing with them what you value. Is it clean water? Is it gas prices? Because they respond to public pressure. And without hearing from their constituents in what they value, where they want to see the future of the government of Canada or the United States go, they will only then take on the objectives of those who are speaking to them, those who are lobbying with them, those who are sharing money or sponsoring them. And right now that is Enbridge. They are a $1 billion corporation. They have the power and the ability to be in the halls of government. And unless we are collectively using our voices to amplify the things that we care about, it will be drowned out in the noise that Enbridge makes. And so it's extremely important that we engage our politicians from every micro level of government all the way to the very top, and that we are deliberate in what we are sharing with them and deliberate in what we are expecting from them, which is protecting the Great Lakes, protecting clean water, uplifting the voices and the rights of Indigenous people, and honoring the promises that we made in the past to carry into the future. And so whether that's through an individual letter you write, a constituent appointment you set up with your representative, signing a petition, going to a public hearing on Line 5, engaging, with activist groups on how you can share information across social media. All of that is so important and needs to be done on both sides of the border. We can only do so much here in the United States to make the government of Canada care, because why would they care about us? We're not their constituents. And so it's really only by having cross-border alliances that we can now bring Turtle Island to the fight and, be the war turtle that we need to be and to protect and defend our homelands.
Jamie Gwetch Whitney, and I love that, like, war turtle. That's
I just had a great visual, I was like, we can do it.
as I see it with the bow and arrow. Just kidding. That was, yes, thank you so much. Okay, yeah, Aurora, over to you.
There's so much following Whitney. I'll just say that, right, it is like it's tough, very tough as a mother and an activist and an advocate in such a small community. It is really, really hard. And folks want to know, what can they do and how can they help? And mind you, a majority of these officials are elected officials, yes. And I think of a variety of ways that I try, to stay strong, and how do I maintain and how am I able to carry on with these fights and what I feel is really important. I do that in a variety of ways as well. Personal ceremony, connection, with other folks that this is also difficult for. And then I always think about my family, and I say this a lot because there's so many different ways that people can contribute. And when we learned this during our last threat, and like I said, this is going to be ongoing, which is why we created our what we call a NEPA, our protection alliance, because first it was this and then it was that. 10 years ago it was mining. The pipeline was still there as well, but we knew that Enbridge was going to fight us, that they could, and that the potential of them winning was also valid. So we had to prepare. And there's not just a one-shot straight answer, although we wish there was. And we put that in the hands of a judicial system. But in other ways, we've held ceremony in these regions, in this area, asking our ancestors and asking so many, to help us, to guide us, for that type of strength that we're looking for. There's obviously a variety of ways. Vote, volunteering, and I've really liked how Whitney talked about the values, and how those are so important to us, because what's at risk has to be commodified. It makes it really difficult. I just gave testimony about what Bad River means in regards, what we're going to give. We're going to give testimony in regards to what Bad River means and our spiritual connection. And it was just a really difficult interview to go through, because they want me to point out one tree, or they want me to like pull a certain cup of water out of the lake and say this, and right here. But those are things that are difficult to articulate, but we're trying really hard, and put that in essence, that it's more than just the land that you're running through your pipeline. You could remediate, you could do cleanups like they have proposed to do. And we've already seen their track record with other communities, and obviously how they're dealing with Bad River and how they're dealing with Bay Mills with no regard. It just sets us up for a really big war. But I really am grateful for all the participants here for listening to us and joining with us. I'm really grateful for the opportunities to share the information. And I'll go back to our values and also our purpose. You know, we have a greater purpose as Anishinaabe people, as First Nations, just as humans that live on this earth in general. And what those obligations are, and also what your potentials are. So I have a little sister, and she could never speak in front of anyone, really. I think I spoke for her my whole life. They wanted to know her name, and I told them. They wanted to know how old she was, and you know, she was 4. But so my sister wouldn't be able to sit in a webinar with you all and share all this really important stuff. But that doesn't make it unimportant to her, and that doesn't make her any less valuable in this fight. And I want to share that with you because my sister has a specific talents that I don't have. You know, she beads just these amazing water droplets that, you know, we get to wear around in our communities. She's just an amazing seamstress. You know, she makes these beautiful ribbon skirts for us to, you know, go to these speeches and to raise awareness. Those are her talents, and those are her values and things that she's able to contribute in a sense. And I just want you guys to think about that too, as you're wondering, well, what can you do and how can you help? Other than finding it within yourself and sharing your talent with the world and your purpose, and sharing that with us and others. I guess that's the best that I could. Thank you. Which
Jamie Aurora. I always really appreciate like how both of you like just speak from the heart, and I mean that's how Indigenous people speak, is from the heart, and I find it very powerful. It's really as you said, it's really hard to put into words, but as you said, people are trying to, just exactly like what we're fighting for and how important these places are and why they're so important. Because it is something that is happening on like more of a feeling and a spiritual place, and it's coming from a really deep place. And in terms of like treaty rights, inherent rights, and all of that, I do just want to acknowledge that for Indigenous peoples, our first treaties are with creation. They're with, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself right now as well, but like, but others, like it's, and with creator, that those supersede even the treaties made with colonial powers. But then, as others have pointed out, treaties are also the supreme law of the land in places like, you know, in the US. So there is a lot at stake when it comes to upholding Indigenous rights and sovereignty and inherent rights. And I do just want to read a quote from the Anishinaabe Nation because they couldn't be here to speak tonight. But this quote is from them, and it says, "The Anishinaabe Nation supports the shutdown of Line 5. Our communities have collectively stood in solidarity with our relations across the pipeline to protect the land and water against the potential for catastrophic environmental damage. For centuries, peoples of our nations have been caring for the Great Lakes. We are relying on these waters for our way of life. We will be relieved when this pipeline is effectively decommissioned permanently, and we express our gratitude to our relatives who have been leading this critical fight for years." And when I think about issues to do with sovereignty and jurisdiction, and we were talking about who really has the right to make these decisions, because we've got this pipeline crossing, it goes across Wisconsin, Minnesota, it's delivering oil to Ontario and Quebec, there's Canada, US at play, Indigenous nations, and I think we really, like, for me, it's like the Anishinaabe Nation, who's traditionally governed the entire Great Lakes, really should be listened to and respected on this one. The Three Fires Confederacy and that governance model, which where Line 5 is running through, is actually like at the heart of all of that. that's really, I think, the way that we need to make our decisions about this. And Canada and the US both need to be looking towards the Anishinaabe Nation for that. And here in Canada, when Canada invoked the 1977 Pipeline Treaty in both the Michigan case and in the Bad River Band case, not once did they invite like First Nations to the table to talk about like what they thought about the pipeline and how it impacts First Nations of the Great Lakes here. They just had a lot of industry folks come to the table and pro pipeline folks come to the table to talk about just how important like this pipeline is to them, and didn't speak to Indigenous nations, which is obviously wrong for many different reasons. And yes, so I'm really grateful that we've been able to go through some of this tonight and hear a bit from you all. There's a lot more that can be told about all of this in longer periods of time, but I know that people are all busy, so we tried to get as much as we could into this amount of time. And I do want to take this moment right now to also highlight that we do have industry expert analyses, which Environmental Defense had commissioned, and Bad River Band also in the court case had several analyses commissioned to help with that court case, which show that there's viable alternatives to Line 5 that will allow for the required product to make it to market and meet our crude oil energy demands in the region. This can be done with some retooling of the existing pipeline network and can accommodate most of the oil to move through another newer pipeline that serves the same region. And so there's really no excuse at this point. Like, we do not have to compromise our energy security to shut down this pipeline, but the ongoing operation of Line 5 is a direct threat to the existential it's a direct and existential threat to the inherent and treaty rights of Indigenous nations here. And it's also a national freshwater security threat to Canada, the US, and Indigenous nations. Enbridge and others and their allies will like to talk about energy security. Well, we've done our homework and we know that we don't need to compromise energy security, but we really are gambling with our freshwater security. And so it's imperative we must implement a planned shutdown in order to uphold Indigenous rights and protect the Great Lakes, which are a drinking water source for over 40 million residents and home to over 4,000 plant and animal species. It cannot be overstated how incredibly important this freshwater system is. And I really think that it should become clear to people that, as has been mentioned, Enbridge is not motivated by the same things that folks like myself and President Gravelle and Aurora and other Indigenous land defenders and water protectors and allied non-Indigenous land like water protectors as well. They're not motivated by the same thing. And to have them try and speak as an authority, which I've seen them try and do on things like Great Lakes protection and Indigenous rights, I do find it's kind of laughable, because they're not the authority on what it means to protect these lands and waters. The Anishinaabe Nation is, to be honest. And I think that's a key takeaway that I'd like folks to understand. So we have alternatives that are within reach. We don't need to violate Indigenous rights. We don't need to compromise the safety of the Great Lakes and basically offer it up as a sacrifice zone. So we really need to push for that, for its closure. And so now we're going to open it up to, actually, before we do that, I think that I want to just make sure we share this in time. But we have a few calls to action of our own and some links to share. So I would like for everybody, one of the calls to action is to sign our petition. So we have a Canadian petition, and then we also have one for US folks to sign that are basically what we're asking for. The petition within Canada is that we are urging the government of Canada to withdraw its use of the 1977 Pipeline Treaty in both the Michigan case and the Bad River Band case, and to respect the Anishinaabe tribes and First Nations of the Great Lakes who are exercising their inherent treaty and sovereign rights as the original stewards of these lands and waters, and calling for the shutdown of Line 5. We're urging the government to uphold Indigenous rights and sovereignty in alignment with UNDRIP, and to put the long-lasting health and preservation of the Great Lakes ahead of the short-term financial interests of Enbridge. And we also want Canada to withdraw its support for the proposed tunnel plan, that it wants to blast a tunnel through sacred Anishinaabe territory. It's a very dangerous plan as well for many different reasons. There's many flags concerned by experts about this plan. It cannot go through. And also we want Canada to withdraw its support for the rerouting of 65 kilometers of pipeline around Bad River Band territory. That will still be within Bad River Band's watershed. And we don't need that. We don't need new infrastructure, fossil fuel infrastructure investments in either of these cases, because we have other alternatives within reach. Amidst the transition that we're in right now, we're asking the government to also advance the electrification of the energy grid and the accessibility of clean renewable energy alternatives to meet our energy needs, and to shut down this pipeline and utilize the alternatives that are within reach. So if you go to stopline5.ca, that has our report, and there is a take action. You can click at the bottom of the page to sign our petition. And then in the chat, there's also one calling on President Biden to revoke the presidential permit for Line 5. And then also we're going to share a link. You can sign up on the water page of Environmental Defense for our water list, so you can follow and get updates on this, on everything that's going on. And there's also a link to our donation page that's specific for this, specific for the Line 5 fight. There's people in the audience that if you can, whatever you can contribute, that will help us in our efforts to continue this work and to enhance the work that we're doing. And if there's anybody who's in the audience that maybe is somebody, or you know somebody that has means to actually contribute a significant amount to this work and you feel called to do so, you can get in contact with me. My contact information is, I think it was on the slide, but I'll put it in the chat. So it's, and I'll give you my email, and we can talk about how you can help financially support this work. And I think that other than that, yeah, we will send a follow-up email to folks with more opportunities about how they can get involved in pushing Canadian decision makers on this. And so, you know, the decision makers who we're targeting are Melanie Joly, the Minister of Foreign Affairs. She's invoked the 1977 Pipeline Treaty. Mark Miller, the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. Minister Stephen Guilbeault of Ministry of Environment and Climate Change Canada. Minister Jonathan Wilkinson of Natural Resources Canada, and then also the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as well. And yes, so now let's take some questions. We do have some time for some questions, and it's okay if we go a little, I think Aurora might need to drop off, and maybe she already did, but we can go through some questions with you all. And let me just open some of that. Okay, just give me a second. Actually, I don't know if Paula or Colleen, do you want to come on and maybe like start with some of the questions that you'd like us to get to? Okay, so one of the questions is, what are the barriers preventing politicians or Enbridge from taking action? At this point, to me, the barriers that they're saying is that we can't live without Line 5 and that the sky will fall if we shut it down. But those barriers are not barriers if we've done our homework and found that we actually can meet our energy needs without Line 5. Okay, so are there penalties to companies like Enbridge when Line 5 deteriorates and pollutes the ecosystem? So that's a really good question. And as far as I know, no, there's not. I don't know if Whitney, you've got an answer for that. What I also can say is that they don't have insurance to properly clean up any oil spill. And in fact, in Ontario, in the Auditor General's report, they were the top spiller, and it was noted by the Auditor General that the Ministry of the Environment here does not ever record, is not ever able to get the money back from Enbridge or like a lot of the spills when they happen. It's the taxpayers that are footing the bill. And of course, a lot of the oil, especially with crude oil, it sinks. So it'd be really difficult to clean up. But yeah, I don't know, Whitney, if you've got that to that question, are there penalties for when this like pipeline deteriorates and pollutes the ecosystem?
I would want to define penalties in a little bit more broader context because Enbridge is usually liable for a portion or if not all of the cleanup costs that are associated with an oil spill. But what we're finding is, what does the definition of cleanup actually mean? When we look at our relatives down at the Nottawasapi Huron Band of Potawatomi who suffered the Line 6B rupture, which occurred right next to their reservation along the Kalamazoo River spill, they are still seeing the impacts of that spill today. And there's still areas of water and land that they cannot harvest or hunt on or gather because the items, the medicines, the monomen that might grow there would then be considered toxic for human consumption. And so, if you were to ask Enbridge, their obligation for cleanup has been met, but more than a decade later, we're still seeing that harmful impact from that oil spill continue today. And so I don't think the obligation has been met at all. And what we've seen as a result of the Line 6B spill was a consent decree entered into between the Environmental Protection Agency and Enbridge. And there has been penalties associated with the compliance outlined in that consent decree. But in general, there's been no other type of leverage against fossil fuel companies when these types of catastrophic oil spills occur. And it also requires us to detail harm, which is another really important question raised when we talk about Line 5, because again, like what does cleanup mean? What does harm mean? If you've harmed an area enough that you can no longer exercise a cultural right or a treaty right, how do you quantify the harm? For me, it's unquantifiable, but in modern society, they always want to associate a monetary amount with the type of harm. And sometimes no amount of money in the world can mitigate or make up for the harm that has occurred.
Exactly. And there's that really famous saying of you can't drink oil. So, and you can't eat money either.
You can try, but it's not very good.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. We can get to maybe one more question. I saw a couple there's one there I'm seeing. Okay. The human rights of the people who depend on water might be an issue to bring before courts of law. Has that been tried? So I guess saying for this person, and Whitney, you can definitely speak to some of this, but there is like a court case on behalf of Michigan State that Bay Mills is an intervener in the tunnel process that's related to that court case. And then the Michigan governor cited the public trust doctrine as one of the things, which is like the public trust doctrine has to do with protecting the waters in the interest of the people. And it's something that actually also can be used in Canadian law, but we don't have the best laws in situations like this when it comes to like potential big rupture down the line of how do we protect ourselves from it. And yeah, Whitney, I don't know if you want to speak a bit more to that in terms of what we
so domestically rights to water are very different depending on what side of the United States you reside. If you are in Western water law, that has typically been litigated or determined down to the very last cup of water or liter of water that might exist in a river or stream or tributary. It's very different here on the eastern side of the United States where those types of divisions are not made under law, and that is just simply a result because there's more water here. But what I think this question is also getting to is there a codified right to water? And I think that's something that we're going to start to see develop more in the future under state law and under federal law, and as well as under international law. There are mechanisms in international law that allow for you to report a sovereign government for denying a basic human right, like a basic right or access to water, a basic human right whether it be to the environment, to culture, you know, to person and to livelihood. But unfortunately, when we look at international mechanisms, it depends on if the governing sovereign has adopted those mechanisms and whether they will listen to the recommendations as a result of the investigation or review that takes place under international law. So still extremely important, but you know, where does it come into play for an individual, I think still remains to be seen and remains to be developed under federal law.
Thank you so much. Well, I know that we're at 7:21 now, so I think that we can wrap it up. So I just want to say, first of all, thank you to the speakers that came tonight. And, you know, maybe there'll be another opportunity, I'm sure there will be, to have First Nations voices speaking about this topic alongside tribal voices as well. So keep yourselves on the lookout for that down the road. And just want to say a huge thank you to everyone that's in the audience. Kachimik, thank you so much for joining tonight. And it's really encouraging to see how many people are interested in learning more about this and interested in learning more about how you can take action to protect the Great Lakes for the 7 generations to come. For me, I really want to iterate that this is more than anything, this is about being for the Great Lakes. Like, yes, there is a pipeline we want to shut down because of the threat that it poses to the Great Lakes. But this is for the Great Lakes. And that is really what we all need to be thinking of first when we're making our decisions about what we need to do with this pipeline. And so with that, I'll also just say, please keep in touch with us on Environmental Defense. You can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. It's Enviro Defense with a C, the Canadian way of spelling it. And that's our handle, and you can reach us out to us via email. And just stay updated on what's going on with the Line 5 fight, and definitely watch out in your inboxes for, we'll be sending an email with all the links and everything and other ways to get involved. So with that, thank you very much. And that closes the night off for all of us.